I came to be interested in food and food studies in some ways for almost all of my professional life, and in some ways very recently. I started writing a dissertation about grocery stores in the mid to late 1990s at the University of Wisconsin. And at the time, I imagined that I was working as a women's historian and a historian of capitalism. And that was how I identified myself, and those were the professional associations that I attended. I had one little serendipitous blip where the Hagley, which is a business history archive and library, sponsored a conference about food and business in I think it was 99. And that really, and I presented a paper that went very well. And it made me think that maybe one day I would have something to say to people who studied food. But I still didn't think of myself as a person who worked around food or food issues. So I worked on this project for a very long time, and then eventually made my way to the University of Minnesota, where over time sort of luckily for me, the university hired people who do think of food and agriculture as what they work on centrally, and who are incredibly generous. And they invited me to join their groups, and they read my work, and they shared their thoughts with me, and they introduced me to other work that I hadn't, outside of history, that I hadn't known about. And that really opened up the world of food scholarship and food studies scholarship to me. And so gradually I began to think of what had been a project that just made claims about the history of women and the history of capitalism and how those things intersected, into a project that also looked at the ways that food was central to that intersection. And that sort of intellectual conversation grew into more concrete professional collaborations. So out of conversations and affiliations with other folks who work on food, Valentine Cadjo and I organized a conference on how we talk about talking about food, sort of across the social sciences and humanities. And that, very luckily for us, IAS was interested in that, and that got picked up by them, and we put the conference on in spring of 2011. And now I do identify myself as somebody who works on food and food studies, although it's still not entirely clear to me what that's going to mean forever. So now I'm working on a new project that is very different from my other project, but also about food, which is a biographical rethinking of Julia Child and her career.
I'm wondering how being interested in food placed you in like the early days in your graduate study.
Right. It's interesting. Well, early in my graduate study, I would never have said I was interested in food because I wasn't. It wasn't a thing that I thought about, except, this is sort of something we can talk about later, but in the interesting way that I think academics are socialized around food. So socially, I cared a lot about food, but intellectually I would not have said that it was important to me. What placed me in a more difficult position in graduate school was that I cared about and was sort of centrally occupied with questions about gender history and questions about capitalism, because it was a moment when very few people would have said that they did both things as central to their work. And that was the bridge that I really had to cross in a lot of ways. So, which was both, as I always tell people, it's both time-consuming and utterly necessary. So I went to lots of conferences because I go to business history conferences and women's history conferences. I talk with historians of capitalism and with historians of women and gender. And at the time that I was in graduate school, the history of capitalism was also was just sort of coming into its own. So I spent a lot of time persuading people in that field that thinking about gender was more than just adding women into the mix, that it involved rethinking how we think about capitalism. And then I had to sort of persuade or at least I tried to present myself to scholars of women and gender as somebody who could think about gender and gender systems, and also capitalism in critical ways. You know, that you could be a historian of business and capitalism and not be celebratory. So that was the thing I worked on there. So I was in some ways, I did make things hard for myself in graduate school by choosing that. But it wasn't food so much that put me on the outside. By the time I got interested in food, I was already here, and it was very much as part of a community of people who were coming to see food as central to their work.
You promised a little discussion of the way academics are socialized
Yeah.
with respect to food. Let's not put that off. Could you
Yeah.
say a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, this is just something that I think is funny and interesting, and it may come out in the next project about Julia Child. I think that food matters in the social life of academics. Now, some people have written about this, so it's not as if I came up with this idea completely on my own. Lisa Heldke has very interesting work about academics and her own sort of what people consider as exotic food. But I feel like, and have long felt like, food occupies this very interesting role in the social world that academics inhabit, in that important things happen over food a lot. There's job candidate dinners, there's dinners where you take out speakers, even informal parties with friends, which are very often, certainly through grad school and even now, are often potlucks where people sort of bring food. The food that you eat and the food that you choose for other people to eat is also a way of performing a certain kind of sociality and a certain kind of status. And yet, so I think that it functions as a way for people to achieve a kind of class mobility. Certainly it functioned that way for me, and I think it functions that way for other people. At the same time, the work of procuring that food very often is either obscured or not part of that same performance. So the work of ordering food for a meeting, or or cooking for a department dinner, that kind of work is generally assumed not to be the academic's job. That's supposed to be somebody else's job. And it's interesting to me that division is so often crucial to the status of academics.
I don't have to worry about how to get the food there.
Or I can tell somebody else what I want and they'll go get it for me. It's not so much that you don't worry about it as it is that you don't do the work of figuring out how to get it. So you could say, I'd like to get dinner for 50 from this restaurant. Or I'd like to get a dinner that's sort of exotic. And somebody else thinks about the mechanics of all that.
So food is more important in academics' lives than they have reflected.
I actually think academics think about it a lot. I don't think that they haven't reflected it, but I think that that food occupies an important role in the ways that academics socialize, and that socializing among academics is an important arena of academic life.
The other thing you mentioned is this capitalism connection. How do you think about capitalism in food?
Oh, I think about that a lot. So I'm really interested in the ways that capitalism is what people would now call embedded, that it's part of other systems. It doesn't, in other words, it reflects the social ideas and the cultural practices of the moment, of the historical moment in which it's operating. And food is just a fantastic way of revealing that embeddedness. So as it is also a very good way of getting at the significance of capitalism. So I am particularly interested in the ways that food is procured is gotten for people and how that reflects the social workings of larger economic systems. So, for instance, questions of what kind of business model is understood to be workable or not workable, how much a store can reasonably charge for food, what kinds of services they can offer, who it is who's expected to be the customer, what happens when somebody who's not the typical customer comes into a grocery store. We've probably all had experiences of walking into a store and realizing that you're in the wrong store. You don't fit in that store. Those are the kinds of moments that to me reveal not just the difficulties of getting food, but also, and the work and the way that getting food is labor, but also the ways that the ways that capitalism operates through these social conventions and through our politically charged social interactions between buyers and sellers.
I remember a conversation in my neighborhood, which is North Minneapolis, where they were going to bring. This is an area that was gutted in the riots. There isn't anything in on Plymouth Avenue to speak of. So there was a proposal that a discount foods enterprise come in there, and one of the kind of low-end discount foods that can come up with great quantities of olive oil for some odd reason, and the next week, slightly dented mushrooms, so forth. And the response in the neighborhood was, A, we don't want used food, but the other point was, these are people who, having sort of arrived, wanted to shop at Byerly's. And this was very important to them. Not everybody certainly, but it was very important. They were shopping at Byerly's, and this would send the wrong message.
It's really interesting the way that and that's one thing that I am really interested in is the ways that where you shop are a marker of class and class identity.
And it must come out in those faculty dinners like crazy.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, you got junior faculty, senior faculty, left-leaning faculty, conservative faculty.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Right. Are you a person who is willing to get bottled water, or do you want to get bottled water do you want to get the water in a tank and give everybody a cup? Does that seem low class? All of these very subtle questions are worked out in decisions about food.
Is anybody doing tap water these days?
Is anybody working on tap water?
I don't know what I mean. Is anybody in faculty gatherings you go to providing tap water?
Oh, well, my department does.
Okay.
Or at least it has.
That's comforting. I remember we had a moving seminar in the philosophy department. It met at faculty houses and student houses. And there was a very distinctive beverage associated, and a distinctive spread associated with each person. And then there was the purist, who would never provide anything, because he was always working on the text until the last minute, and this was the message he sent. This is not about food.
That's really, really funny.
Everybody else had these kind of very distinctive matters. As an interviewer, I'm always trying to understand disciplines a little bit and what's happening. And one thing that occurs to me as you talk is, this would make perfect sense to me if I were talking to a cultural anthropologist of the kind I used to run into in the 70s. So where's the disciplinary boundaries here? I mean, between history and cultural anthropology, and they're probably, it seems, I've had these kinds of conversations with people in design and architecture too. How does that work for you? How do you understand yourself kind of disciplinarily? What makes you an historian, given the kind of questions you're asking? Yeah,
it's funny because I think I never had to answer that question a couple of years ago when I was more conventionally historical. One thing I would say is that you're hearing those connections because I learn a lot from people in cultural anthropology and people in design and all over the university. And my work has really been shaped by those conversations and the questions that folks ask. The other thing I would say is that there has always actually been a lot of overlap between a lot of disciplines, but sometimes it takes a topic that is really charged and gets everyone together to make everyone realize that those overlaps exist in our thinking, in our proclivities, and in our commitments. So I think the thing that makes me a historian is that when I'm in those conversations with people from outside history, I'm the person who says, but what about the context in which this is happening? What explains what your respondents are telling you? Where are they living? Did you ask about family size? So I'm the person, I always say historians are troublemakers, because we're the people who say, you've come up with a very nice model here, but if you look at this same phenomena in a different time and place, it works out very differently. So what is it that, so rather than thinking transhistorically about coming up with a model that explains this across space and time, I want to think about how, sort of go in depth and think about what this phenomena, what this moment, what this grocery store tells us about this time and place. How does it reveal a larger truth about the context in which it's operating?
Does that mean then that historically you're working on a fairly small time frame? I mean, I'm thinking that the kinds of explanations, for example, as to why the Riverside Market failed and was replaced by Seward Co-op, mm-hmm. I mean, we're talking, it's an interesting story, but we're talking probably a 30 to 40 year timeline. For some of the shifts in how food is provided, in what people serve, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I tend to work on timelines of a couple of decades. That's a function, of, frankly, of being a modern U.S. historian.
I see.
My colleagues who are early modern historians or certainly medieval, they work on much, much longer time frames, and they have much more to work with.
Well, is there a fight in history about time frames? I mean, are there people who are saying you can't work this close to the present, or you can't work on 2 decades because, as it were, it's too compressed to see anything? I mean, is there that kind of fight in the discipline, or have people kind of agreed that she does her thing, I do my thing, they're different, that's fine?
You know, I feel like I have to speak personally here. Yeah. My experience is that historians are a pretty live and let live bunch of people. There are really profound differences in our methods and in the ways we ask questions and what we ask questions about. And there are moments where those ruptures appear. But at this particular moment and in my own career trajectory, I haven't had too many people say to me, you can't tell a story that only covers a couple of decades. Historians as a group, I think, value the scope and the scale of your claims even more than they care about whether the model you've used resembles their model. So if you can come up with a story that tells that's compelling and that seems to reveal an important truth about a vital historical shift, people care about that.
But where, I imagine the fight starts coming in with regard to this vital historical shift. I mean, going back to, the example that just occurred to me, there once was a little grocery store that was very good.
Right.
Modest and weird, but, and very conventional.
Right.
On the West Bank. And they couldn't make certain needed repairs, so they left and were replaced by a co-op. Right. Which then could make the repairs to do a much fancier and, I think, much more expensive operation than they ever did. Now, for the people who lived around there, the people in the high-rises around, big deal. Mm-hmm. But does that sort of thing count as a vital shift?
Well, it's the historian's job to make clear that it's vital, right? That's your job.
But I mean, what are your criteria? What's your standard for vital? I mean, in some, how do you, how do you make that argument about whether one thing is vital or another?
I guess the way that what I tell people is that historians' job is to see the universe in a grain of sand, to borrow a famous quote. And so you look at something like the closing of Riverview Market or the opening of Seward Co-op, and you say, well, what does this tell us about immigration in the 20th century? How was this moment shaped by, and how does it reveal something about the economy's, alternative economies? How does it reveal neoliberalism? How does it not reveal, how does it reveal the limits of neoliberalism? You look for and try and make clear. Sorry. It's okay. And try and make clear the bigger picture that's at stake in the moment that you're writing about. And if you come to feel like the thing that you're writing about doesn't have that in it, can't reveal those larger truths, then you move on and reframe it or go do something else.
Right. So if it turns out that part of the story of the closing of the Riverside Market is that there was a very cranky guy in charge of the place who wasn't very smart about money and renovations, let's say. If it turns out that it's that peculiar, then maybe a novelist would be interested in it, but the historian says, I can't touch that, I can't go forward with this. This seems to depend so much on things peculiar to just this case.
I think that's probably true, but I would never say that a historian couldn't make something of that. There are all kinds of examples of anecdotes that historians passed by until somebody else came along and said, oh my God, this is crucial to understanding women's labor or the emergence of food systems. So it's as much about your own imagination and your own particular historical position as it is about some kind of obvious facts. And we create the facts in the story. So,
but if I'm understanding you right, the test is that whatever it is you're studying has to illuminate some rather large general concept, like women's labor, like
or World War II, or it could also eliminate a shift that is at the moment you're writing is understood as being important, like slavery or World War II or the Cold War or something like that.
But not the quirkiness of a particular family, not the quirkiness of a particular
I think
block.
If that's the sum total of what you're doing, that is a history. I mean, that is historical. But if it doesn't speak to larger themes, then I think that most historians wouldn't be that interested in it.
I see.
That's what I would say.
Of course, it might be extremely interesting that it doesn't speak to larger themes.
It might be, yeah, right. And I would say I'm a person who can often find importance in everyday things. And so, a store being run by a quirky manager who's really difficult sort of speaks to the idiosyncrasies that govern food retailing, right, and that govern people's access to food. Having a crazy person run your grocery store where you need to go every day is a very different experience from walking into Cub or Byerly, or a larger chain where you have less access to that person.
This is deeply fascinating to me. So one of the big generalities that you were promising to work on, we've talked a little bit about capitalism. The other is gender. Mm-hmm. Could you say just a little bit about your food and gender thinking?
Sure. So this actually does go pretty far back. I was a historian. I was committed to being a women's historian and a historian of gender before I was committed to anything else, even long before I was in graduate school. I always tell people that all the blame for my becoming an academic lies with my high school AP US history teacher who wore a button one day that said, "Write women back into history." And it was like a window shade went up on a window for me. And I thought, I've never, ever read anything about women. And because I was already a person who liked history and historical thinking, I stayed interested in women's history throughout undergraduate throughout my undergraduate training, and then eventually made my way to University of Wisconsin that had one of the strongest women's history programs in the country. I think I came to food because I was interested in gender and women, because I wanted to be able to talk about women's consumption and the world of consumer society that both was clear about the importance of gender and gender systems in the functioning of retail and consumption and consumer society, but also would allow me to show the material, quantifiable, unmistakably structural significance of women's consumption and women's labor. And food has turned out to be a place where I can do that in kind of exciting ways that I hadn't anticipated when I started. The other story I always tell that in some ways encapsulates this is when I was very young, one of the rituals in my house was that I would go shopping, grocery shopping with my mother. So maybe she also is to blame. And one day she left me by the supermarket fish counter to wait in line to get some whitefish that was on sale while she walked around. And it turned out it was a really good sale on whitefish, and they didn't have quite enough. So it was a very rowdy crowd by the counter, and people started, these much older women, I was a young kid, these much older women started elbowing me aside and screaming at each other and yelling, "You took my fish. You took the last good fish. What's she doing here? What's that kid doing here? Get her out of here." And I thought, I was both really taken aback, but also it was a moment that really, I guess, imprinted on me that important things happen around women and food, and that there's a lot of stakes set on food and the kind of food you buy. So I started to see, and I guess I've come to see food as kind of what's the word that I'm looking for? The vehicle for performing gender and for both resisting and reinforcing norms about what women should and shouldn't do and how families should and shouldn't work, and also a really important force in actual survival of households and families.
I remember as a kid, my dad was away. There wasn't a babysitter, so I got taken to a lot of women's club luncheons. Mm-hmm. And I think those were probably programmed by women's magazines. I had a sense that there was a ritual that mm-hmm. was pretty much prescribed, and people varied it in various ways, but it was very much variations on a theme rather than anything radical.
Right.
And great jokes have been made about this, I mean, the lettuce with things in it. Sorry, the Jell-O with things in it, which is a Minnesota staple. So there was, but the thing that was so striking about that was, in some sense, how much people were taking their advice about how to be homemakers from the magazines.
Yeah, there's been some scholarship. I haven't talked about this a lot yet. There's been actually some work on this, and what people have, sort of sussed out is that people did these, sort of women's magazines and prescriptions about cooking were influential, but not always because women followed them religiously. As you said, right, there were variations in what was in the Jell-O or what salads were made, whether there were finger sandwiches or other kinds of, or punch or the other options. And those choices, even though to us, in retrospect, and maybe to you as a kid, they looked so small as to be meaningless, those variations matter a lot to the people involved and often to the people eating as well as the people cooking. So, for instance, one really interesting phenomena in the post-war period is the growth in casseroles and casserole cooking, partly because you could use ready-made foods in it and canned foods, but also because it was the kind of dish that could be varied very easily. And so families kind of came up with their own variations on casseroles. And I think that the important thing to understand about that moment in food is that prescriptions matter, but not always in the way that their authors want them to or intend them to.
Well, I would guess that sort of behind the magazine articles were the people who were selling various things.
Yeah,
sometimes. Who wanted to market those things. It's like the relationship between the beauty magazines and the cosmetic books, that there's something very tight going on there.
Yeah, I mean, food manufacturers and food processors are really important advertisers in newspapers as well as magazines. And they do seem to have had influence on food editors, the people who tended to write those kinds of articles and essays. But I think that by the same token, home economists and food editors often genuinely understood these products as helping people and genuinely felt like they could offer people some good. So I wouldn't want to suggest that women's magazines were captured always by processors and manufacturers. It could also have been genuine commitment to the notion that this way of cooking was easier and was better.
But it seems to be a fascinating issue where the zone of freedom is, and where the zone of creativity is, and where you have the story of a script being written in very powerful advertising rooms, and handed out to very friendly food writers, and the Orange Juice Promotion Council, the Milk Promotion Council, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, that's honestly one of the reasons that Julia Child is so interesting to me as a person, because she came along in this moment that was in many ways the height of that sort of articulation between food manufacturers and women's magazines and the use of processed food. And she navigated it in really interesting ways that I will admit I'm still figuring out. But she promoted, she was very interested in promoting the use of non-processed foods or minimally processed, and pretty basic ingredients. At the same time, I think she wasn't opposed at all to the use of mass-produced food. She encouraged women to buy ingredients for her recipes at supermarkets. But she's sort of an interesting bridge from this moment of mass production and mass processing to a moment when an emphasis on what people might call whole foods or whole ingredients and really laborious cooking took over in the 70s and 80s. And so I think she's a really interesting figure in understanding how that transition happened and why it appealed in the way that it did.
I'd expect that one battleground for this kind of freedom and programming fight would have been the home economics classes and the history of the home economics classes over the years.
Yeah, it is. The history of home economics is fascinating. It's really, really interesting. And that was a place where these battles were fought, often quite explicitly. There were many home economists who went to work for food manufacturers and food processors, but also many who, or even some who went the route of becoming food scientists, but also many who worked in nutrition programs and schools and doing sort of as part of county extension offices. And so home economists were often quite explicit about the pros and cons of sort of making alliances with large food manufacturers and food processors and food retailers. Now, some of the most powerful home economists did make those alliances, and they were really responsible for bringing the message of and sort of stamping with legitimacy these very large businesses that wanted people to believe that their products were wholesome and good for them. But they were also often quite self-conscious and explicit and articulate about why they were doing that. So it's really interesting to read their journals and their writings.
One of the turning points of my life was getting to address a conference of 400 home economists.
Oh, wow.
Maybe it was less than that, I forget. Anyway, it was about 30 years ago. And they'd invited me to be the philosopher at the end of a bunch of presentations on global food issues to home ec teachers who are a dying breed. And it was quite fascinating, demographic there. But it was very clear that if a teacher wanted, the food industry would write their curriculum for them. I mean, all you had to do was mail away. And your bulletin boards were taken care of, your demonstrations were taken care of, it was all fine. I remember a representative of the meat industry was at the conference to make sure that cows weren't bad-mouthed.
Wow.
But it was the sense that here was where a tremendous amount of practical education was being done. The education that probably would matter to people.
Right.
In ways that algebra certainly would never matter. What they were doing would matter to like 90% of the people in their classes.
Right.
This was the place where global food issues could be raised. This was the place where information about nutrition could be brought in and so forth. And it was for that reason a battleground of industry and science in some really important ways. Yeah,
I think that's really, I think that's what makes home economics such an interesting field and such an interesting site of study, is that it is very much a realm that has practical import in people's lives in teaching them how to cook. And also, I would add, particular practical import in making people gendered, right? Because it's, for a very long time, although more recently this hasn't been the case, but for a very long time, they were what women took. Boys took shop and girls took home ec. So it was both about teaching them practical skills, but also about reminding them what kinds of practical skills a person needed to be a woman. And I think that home ec is a place where these very big, the politics of food gets talked about all the time in ways that are big and small. And that people are often quite articulate and explicit about the stakes of what's going on, including, food manufacturers know that, right? That's why they send reps to that meeting, that what these people say really matters to what people do. One thing that I wanted to add that was really interesting about Julia Child, I had the opportunity to just do some research this a couple of weeks ago. Not only was she interested in sort of getting people to think about food and cooking as a different kind of project than many people had been saying before her, but she also was, I think, sort of, she didn't expect this, but she wound up having to combat food manufacturers who kept wanting her to endorse their products. So a lot of her, or at least a significant portion of her correspondence, was manufacturers writing to her saying, maybe you'd like to show this food scale on your show, or perhaps you'd like, I'm sending you this new measuring cup we've devised, and perhaps you'd like to mention it to people. And she was constantly writing back saying, I can't accept this, and I won't endorse your products, and it's the strict policy of public television not to endorse any commercial products. And that, to me, really revealed the ways that particularly high-end food and high-end cooking was embedded with business and capitalism, even in the mid-1960s when she started her show. They really expected her to be able to do this, as had previous cooks on commercial TV. And it was a real sort of shift for her to resist that. The complicated end to that story is that then her own show became a commodity, right? And people asked for her, and so there was her show became worth quite a bit to PBS over time. And I think, I don't know that she cared, that it bothered her, but unintentionally, her show became itself a vehicle for making money for other people, even though I think she continued for most of her life not to endorse, at least on her show.
I was just thinking about, the parallel. You've got, Frances Moore Lappé and, Diet for a Small Planet. You've got Julia Child's French cookbook.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like positioning new food information from culturally above.
Right.
This is what the ambassador serves, okay?
Right.
This is what they serve in Paris. If you've never been to Paris, have you? You might like to go sometime if you have a lot of money. If not, here's a way of doing a chicken that you would eat there. And that's a lot different from saying your food is making you fat and it's making you sick and it's bad for the planet, and if you just eat this whole grain, low to the ground stuff, you're going to be a heck of a lot healthier person and live longer and be better for the planet and so forth. To see Julia Child is in some sense on the new information team with Frances Moore Lappé is pretty interesting.
It is interesting, and I would say she never certainly saw herself as having anything in common with Frances Moore Lappé. And I think that she was right. There are important differences, but it is interesting the ways that she sort of helped to create an identity of among sort of middle and upper class Americans of cooking, and a particular kind of laborious cooking that involved basically unprocessed ingredients as an important marker of class identity and a thing that they ought to be concerned about, a thing that mattered to their lives and that ought to be taken seriously.
So class comes into the story as encouraging some choices which you might want to encourage for lots of other reasons.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah, I think it does, and I think that class identity, I think it's, I'm stating the obvious to say that class is complicated, but I think that it is particularly complicated and also particularly interesting around around food, and particularly around, in the moment that I'm looking at, in the 60s and 70s, around people, the politics that people construct for themselves around food, and the ways that they sort of distribute the labor and understand the work of cooking and serving that food. It was a really crucial moment where Americans especially were working out all kinds of politics and all kinds of commitments and concerns with equality and with health and with women's rights and with environmental concerns, and it really, in very interesting ways, created what now I think we think of in some ways as natural interest around cooking and food as a really central part of families' lives. It was very interesting. I was reading an article in the Star Tribune the other day about how expensive it is to eat healthy. There was just a study that came out a couple of days ago that said that to really eat fully healthy food, the kind of diet that the government is now recommending everybody eats, would cost several $100s more than the amount many people spend on their annual food budgets. And somebody wrote in the comments section, oh, it's not that hard, it's not that expensive, we should eat like people ate in the 40s and 50s. That was when people ate healthy. And I sort of felt, in a lot of discussions about food now, there's this imagined past where everyone ate healthy and where everyone was home cooking and people ate dinner together every night. And it just never, ever happened. I mean, you can go back before the 40s and 50s. Food was always something that families negotiated. It was always more difficult for poor people than for people who were better off. People always ate, particularly people who were pressed for time, like poor people as well as wealthy businessmen, ate food out and did not eat dinner with their families all the time. So as a historian, part of what's interesting to me is the ways that people imagine there was a time when food was good and we should just go back to that moment. There's a kind historical nostalgia that informs current food politics.
That's very funny stuff. I mean, people didn't live long enough to get as fat as they've gotten now, and they actually did some physical labor from time to time, which retarded it a bit.
Right. And I mean, there's all kinds of complicated issues around food and how people and what people ate, and frankly, a lot that we don't know about. I mean, there are really talented people who have computed sort of average diets and nutrition intake and people's heights and things like that. But there's a lot we don't know about the variation in how people ate and what governed that variation.
That's wonderful. I have to tell one quick story, and then we'll find others. But I was visiting my son in New York, and he took me to the place where the sick cab drivers get their food.
Oh.
And this is a little teeny place, and these vegetarian cab drivers come, and they, a couple of scoops of stuff goes onto a bowl, and it costs $3, and you're out of there.
Right.
And I walked in, and I looked at the food, and I looked at Tim, and I said, as long as there's a place like this, things are okay. And it was funny because the person behind me in line looked at me and got it. It was this little moment of, yes, cheap food, 24 hours. It was quite kind of striking. I mean, it was like I touched the thing people are sort of wanting.
Right.
That the thing you imagine must have been back in the past or something.
Right. Yeah, no, that's a lovely story, and I think that those places exist. People get food in all kinds of places.
Yeah. The conference you were talking about happened a while ago.
Right.
So you've had a little time to think about what it means to put on a conference
Right.
like that.
Right.
You think about whether what you wanted to happen happened and so forth. Could you talk a little bit about the conference?
Sure. It's hard to know how far back to go. Basically what happened is that through the food studies reading group that I was part of, I got very interested in work that wasn't historical about food and food studies. And talked with some folks outside of the group as well as with Ann Waltner at IAS about how interesting it would be to sort of, and how much interest there is on campus around food, and the importance of having a place for interdisciplinary conversations around food. And I think a lot of people felt the need for that, not just people in the reading group, but the reading group was positioned to sort of do something about it. So we wound up putting together Minnesota Futures, a successful Minnesota Futures grant to host like a day-and-a-half conference around that brought together people from many disciplines outside of the university as well as people from the university around the theme of differences in how people talk about feeding the world. So the question of how to feed the world informs conversations about food sort of across the academy, from people who are interested in promoting agricultural growth and green revolution types, to business people who are interested in selling food, to other people who might be critical of the ways that the U.S. distributes aid or interventions into other countries and selling them food. So it seemed a theme that connected people from all over, as well as the kind of work that I do, which is on a sort of micro scale about how people actually get the food into their houses. So we organized this, what turned out to be a much bigger conference than we had anticipated, where we invited mostly social scientists from outside the university who were active in food studies, both around agriculture as well as around sort of the social uses of food and the cultural life that food occupies around the world. And then we invited people from campus to present alongside these folks. So we got really, it was very encouraging to have the response that we got from folks on our campus. So we had people from the ag school, ag economists, social scientists, people from sociology and geography and history, all up there talking about how, in their own work, the question of feeding the world has come up, and sort of the ruptures that emerge in the assumptions people make about what it means to feed the world, what kinds of questions you have to ask. Do you ask about money? Do you ask about price? Do you look at the social politics of the household? Do you look at social justice questions? You know, what values does the researcher bring to their own studies about food and nutrition and getting good food out to people? And then we had a very strong sort of response rate among audience members from campus who wanted to come and sort of be part of the symposium. So we had a series of roundtables where people cut at various aspects of the question of feeding the world, and then that were public, although we asked people to register so we'd have a space. And then we opened it up for questions with the audience. And the panels were themselves really interesting intellectually to me, but it was also interesting the level of interest around campus, and also that many of the folks in the audience clearly had some of those preconceptions around that they hadn't fully processed, and that they were being made to confront in these sessions about how people talked about feeding the world. So there was enormous amounts of energy, lots of loud conversation during the conference. And then what I hope ultimately comes out of the conference in the long term are more sustained collaborations between people from different parts of campus, imagining truly interdisciplinary projects that measure and research how people actually get food into their houses, and look really holistically at the work of behind feeding the world, right, and the utility and limits of that as a discourse.
Do you have any evidence that a conference of that kind actually does any of this?
I think that the way that given academics' intellectual lives, these things are extremely hard to measure, right? I mean, how do you measure what one paper did to one person 10 years later when they write their book, right? Those things are hard to know. But there were some also immediate results from this. One thing that happened was that people expressed to us the desire for longer-term kinds of collaboration. So there's a lot of interest in these conversations. Graduate students made contact with advisors outside of their discipline and field and talked with them about their projects and about having them on their committees and having their input on their dissertations. And ultimately, that matters a lot down the road, right? Having graduate students who have sought out interdisciplinary training matters a lot. I know that, and faculty themselves, I think, expressed some interest in forming sort of a longer-term intellectual collaboration group that would get together and read each other's work and talk about, and perhaps some other texts, and talk about the issue of feeding the world. And we're toying around with, and perhaps develop a longer-term research project. The strong advice we got from people who have done interdisciplinary research projects is that the vital thing to do at the beginning is to develop trust and relationships among the investigators. So I think we're at that stage now, where we're learning how to talk with each other and developing relationships that allow us to trust each other enough that we would put our names down on a research project together, and we could effectively administer across the divides of discipline and college.
Now, if I'm getting it right, for that purpose, it's the University of Minnesota people who
Right.
are brought together.
Yes,
that are
exactly.
the key things.
Yes.
I mean, the growth of trust is going to be difficult with the guy from Chicago
Yeah.
who came for 2 days.
Yeah, and that was our goal. Our goal was to encourage collaboration among people here and to get the people from outside to sort of catalyze the conversations that would allow that to happen.
I see. And it also sounds to me like the thing you're surest of in terms of good results of this sort of thing is the effect on graduate students.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
And did you have many graduate students?
We did, and we had undergraduates too. In fact, we had many graduate students came both from agronomy and from the ag end of campus, but also from the social science end of campus. And I think they enjoyed meeting each other, but also connecting with faculty who work on relevant, interesting questions. I think faculty genuinely enjoyed meeting each other, even if we often imagine our work very differently. I had great conversations with people in public health who are interested in nutrition needs among working class people in the Twin Cities. And they were, they didn't really understand how I did my work, and I certainly didn't understand all the measurements they used in their work, but we could talk about our shared commitments to and interest in how people get food.
Well, it's a mystery to me, and an important mystery, I think. I mean, I spend a lot of time, over the years, I've spent a lot of time introducing people to people they never would meet.
Right.
Because I know these two people are the two people in Minnesota who understand this question. They need to talk.
Right.
And they love talking, and I have no evidence that they ever email or call or do anything with each other again, because the demands of individual academic stuff close in on them.
Right.
And these are people who are genuinely nice people.
Right.
I mean, they don't smell. They would have fun with each other, They have, they switch languages in the course of their conversations, I mean, all this, I've seen all the good signs happen.
Right.
And then the clamping down when they go back to their institutions.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about what might be done or what might help to make those initial very exciting conversations move into the kinds of relationships that would result in reading groups and co-authored papers and eventually interdisciplinary programs of various sorts, the whole range of things that might count as results.
I think, and there are actually people who study this, but my experience is that there has to be some institutional commitment to letting that happen, because those kinds of collaborations are disruptive to the ways that most colleges and universities work. People are asking for time to travel or time to not teach or to co-author a paper and have that count in a discipline where papers aren't usually co-authored. So there has to be some office or some dean or some kind of unit that facilitates those conversations.